Good evening. Great to be learning with you on a Sunday, Yom Rishon. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Sunday? Yehud in South Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, Shandora in the Bronx, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Joe in Boston, Paul in the Great Northwest, Tom in PA, Bella in Florida, Joe in the Inland Empire, Lorraine in Texas, Lucy in Minnesota, Marjorie in Georgia, Aoife in Florida, Patrice in Utah, Chaim in Florida, Ella's here, and Franco in Trieste, Italy. Welcome, everybody. Our daf today is page 53. Here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud, continuing our discussion of Mishna number 4 here in chapter 3. We open close to the top on 53a. So the Mishnah teaches that taking possession can be performed by building a fence or breaching a fence even a bit. So the Gemara clarifies, and this is what we were talking about at the end of yesterday, this idea that you need to reside or make use of a property for 3 years in order to establish a presumption of ownership over it. And this would be in the case where somebody lodges a claim against you, like the previous owner says, I never sold it to you. But if you've been residing there for 3 years, then you have the presumption of ownership, and he will have to prove that the land does not belong to you. Whereas if you've been there for less than 3 years, you would have to prove that you are the actual owner now. That is what the presumption of ownership is about. At the end of yesterday's daf, we were talking about, well, in a case where there's no claim against you, where there was ownerless property, for example, the property of a convert who died with no heirs, property that was otherwise deemed ownerless, or something that was sold to you or that was gifted to you, and you just want to make the formal act of acquisition on it, and rather than receive a document and give, in exchange for money, or do the symbolic transfer of ownership by transferring a handkerchief, could you perform an action on that land that indicates that you have begun to reside on it, begun to make use of it, and therefore you are the new owner, and you now get that legal possession immediately? Answer, yes, you can do that. And here were some of the examples, and one of them was the one we're discussing today, this idea that if you put a fence around that property, or you breach the fence within that property even a bit, this can demonstrate to the world that you have stepped in and taken possession of that property. And so now the Gemara asks, well, what is a bit? How much is a bit? Well, it is in accordance with the statement of Shmuel. As Shmuel says, if one had previously built a fence, and now he completed it to a height of 10 handbreadths, 10 tefachim, which is the height of a legally significant barrier, or similarly, if one had previously breached a breach, that he made a breach in the fence, and now he extended it in order that it be large enough that a person can enter and exit through it, this is considered taking possession. Now, the Gemara challenges this and says, what are the circumstances of this fence that you're talking about? If we say that initially one could not climb over it to enter the field, and now too, one still could not climb over it, so what did he accomplish by increasing its height? Nothing has changed through the completing the height of the fence. And alternatively, if the fence was such that initially one could climb over it to enter the field, and now one cannot climb over it, well then he has accomplished a great deal. And the Mishnah should not have referred to this as adding a bit. So the Gemara answers, no, it was necessary to state this ruling if the height of the fence was such that initially one could climb over it with ease, and now one could climb over it only with effort. You've made a qualitative change in the access to that field, and that's enough for you to establish possession of the field. Now, the Gemara similarly asks, what are the circumstances of this breach in the fence? If we say that initially one could enter the field through it, and now, too, one can enter through it, so what did he accomplish? Nothing has changed through his expanding the breach. And alternatively, if it was such that initially one could not enter the field through it, and now one can enter the field through it, well, then he has accomplished a great deal. So you can't say that he expanded the breach a bit. You wouldn't call it a bit. So the Gemara answers, it was necessary to state this ruling if the size of the breach was such that initially one could enter the field through that breach with effort, and now one can enter the field through it with ease. That's considered a qualitative change that you accomplished by widening the breach in the fence. You have demonstrated your intent to take possession of the field, and you now have possession. This is all if accompanied by a situation where you are entitled to take possession of the field because it was ownerless and you're the guy, you're the first one, or because it was gifted to you, or because it was sold to you. Now, if we say that he placed, Rav Asi says that Rabbi Yochanan says, if one placed a stone and it helps to serve some objective, or if one removed a stone and it helps to serve some objective, this act is considered taking possession. So the Gemara asks, well, what is the meaning of placed and what is the meaning of removed? So if we say that he placed a stone in the fence and he stopped the water from flooding the field, or he removed a stone from the fence and thereby fashioned an opening that released water that had been flooding the field, well, this is analogous to one who chases away a lion from another person's property. In other words, these acts prevent damage to the field, which one is obligated to prevent even in the case of the property of another person. And accordingly, they do not constitute a demonstration of ownership. That's something that any decent person would do. If he could just move one rock and stop a flood, he should do that. And therefore, this act does not create a formal act of acquisition on that land. So when we're talking about placing or removing a stone in a way that does create that position, does create that acquisition, how does it work? So rather, it means that he placed a stone that connected water to the field and irrigated it, or he removed a stone and enhanced the flow of water to it. He improved the property. By moving that stone, he created a flow of water. It's like he unstopped a stream which is now available to irrigate that field. Okay, so he definitely enhanced the value of the field even by moving that one stone. New subject. The Gemara cites another statement of the same Amora, that's a rabbi of the Gemara, with regard to taking possession. And Rav Asi says that Rabbi Yochanan says if there were two fields with one boundary between them, and one took possession of one of the fields in order to acquire it, so he has acquired it. Now we're on page 53b. If his intention was to acquire it, that field that he acquired, and also to acquire the other field, which shares a border with it, well, then he has acquired the first field, which is the one that he affected, but he has not acquired the field beyond the boundary. Since the fields are separated by a boundary, they're considered distinct fields, and he only acquired one of them. If he took possession of one field with the intent to acquire the other field, then he has not even acquired the field of which he took possession. Since his intention when he took possession was to acquire a different field, one does not acquire an item unless he has the intention to acquire. Right? So you can't acquire this thinking that you're acquiring that. When you perform an act of possession on this field, but in your mind you think you're taking possession of that one, then you've done nothing at all. Rabbi Zera raises a dilemma. What is the law if one took possession of one of these fields in order to acquire it, and the boundary, and the other field all together? Do we say that the boundary of the land is one, i.e. these two fields are joined by means of their common boundary, and therefore he has acquired all of them? Or perhaps this field stands alone and that field stands alone. And the Gemara notes that the dilemma shall stand unresolved. Let's say there were two ownerless fields. He acquired one of them. He performed an act on one of them. In his mind, he was thinking, I'm acquiring both of them. But we don't have a final answer on that. Since they are distinct fields, it might be that he didn't acquire the second one. If they're two distinct fields and you have the opportunity to acquire both, okay, so perform an action on both of the fields. Rabbi Lazar raises a dilemma. What is the law if one took possession of the boundary between the two fields with the intention of acquiring both of the fields? Do we say that the legal status of this boundary is like the halter of the land, and he acquires the fields just as one acquires an animal through the acquisition of its halter? Or perhaps this field stands alone and that field stands alone, as the boundary is not connected to the field in the same manner that a halter is connected to an animal. And the Gemara notes, Teku, this dilemma shall also stand unresolved. Similarly, Rav Nachman says that Rabba bar Avu says, if there were two houses in a courtyard, this one's situated within the courtyard relative to that one, right? One is further in the courtyard than the other. And he took possession of the outer house in order to acquire it. Okay, so he has acquired the outer house. If his intention was to acquire the outer house and also the inner house, he has acquired the outer house, but he has not acquired the inner house. If he took possession of the outer house in order to acquire the inner house alone, then he has not acquired even the outer house, because he took possession of something without intent to acquire it. He took possession of it thinking he was acquiring something else. He ends up with nothing. If he took possession of the inner house in order to acquire it, he has acquired it. If his intention was to acquire the inner house and also the outer house, then he has in fact acquired both the inner house and the outer house. What's the difference? Since the residents of the inner house possess the right to pass through the outer house in order to enter and exit the courtyard, the outer house is viewed as an extension of the inner house. If he took possession of the inner house in order to acquire only the outer house, then he has acquired nothing at all. New subject. The Gemara continues its discussion of taking possession of ownerless property. Rav Nachman says that Rabba bar Avu says, with regard to one who builds large palaces on the property of a convert who died without heirs, meaning on ownerless land, and another person came and placed doors on those palaces, meaning the first one built a building but didn't finish it, right? A building without doors is not a habitation fit for living in. So he built a structure, but since he left the doors off, it was an unfinished structure, unfit for habitation. And therefore, even though he built a whole palace, the one who then came along and put the doors on it, he acquires the land and the palace because he finished it and turned it into something suitable for living. And the Gemara explains, what is the reason for this? The first one, meaning the one who built the palaces, he merely turned over bricks, i.e. building an incomplete house is not sufficient to take possession of the property. And Rav Dimi, now, probably he could have, marked his construction site and say, I am building a construction site here. And probably if he was smart, on day one, he built, a little tiny house that put a bed in it with a door on it and said, I've acquired this property and this is my tiny house and I'm building that palace, right? But the tiny house would acquire it for him. If he didn't do that, if he set out to build a big mansion, but then he never finished it, probably there would be some sense of abandoning it, and some other guy came along and put doors on it, so he acquired the property. And by the way, it's not so counterintuitive, because this was ownerless property. And somebody who comes along and builds stuff on ownerless property,
that doesn't create a residence for himself, what has he really done? In fact, you could say that he has diminished the value, because the ownerless property prior to this was a field that could be farmed, and now he put up some kind of a structure. It's not fit for living in. Maybe it's not very well built. Maybe it's something that's just going to have to be demolished and taken away. It's not a plus for the property until there's a structure that one could dwell in. Rav Dimi Bar Yosef says that Rabbi Lazar says one who finds palaces built on the property of a convert who died without heirs, and he plastered them with one application of plaster, or he tiled them with one tile, he has acquired them. And the Gemara asks, and how much, i.e. what is the minimum area that must be plastered or tiled? And Rav Yosef said 1 square cubit. And Rav Chisda said, and he acquired it in this manner, only if it was plastered or tiled opposite the entrance where it can be easily seen. Because you're marking the territory, as it were. I'm actually very close to done. If you've got questions or comments, please get them in now. It's another short daf. Rav Amram said, Rav Sheshes said this statement to us, and he enlightened our eyes from a baraisa that alludes to the same matter. He said, one who spreads out mattresses on the property of a convert who died without heirs has acquired it. And that which I said that he enlightened our eyes from a baraisa, what is it? As it is taught in a baraisa, in Tractate Kedushin, how does one acquire a Canaanite slave? Through taking possession, right? So if the slave placed one's shoe for him, or untied his shoe for him, or if it occurred that he carried his garments after him to the bathhouse, or undresses him, or bathes him, or anoints him, or scrubs the oil off him, or dresses him, or puts on his shoes, or lifts him, one acquires the slave. In other words, if the slave did work for you, right, and this was an ownerless slave, and then you came and claimed the slave. Thank God slavery hasn't existed in thousands of years, but when it was practiced, this is how it was practiced. And slaves often had the same laws surrounding their purchase, sale, acquisition, taking possession, etc., as real property. So here, if there's an ownerless slave and somebody comes along and claims him and is able to get him to do work for him, then he's taken possession of the slave. Now note that the last thing in that list was that the slave lifts this new master. Now Rabbi Shimon said, the acquisition generated by taking possession should not be considered greater than the acquisition generated by lifting, as lifting acquires property in any situation, right? So the more general case of acquisition, a king in a formal act of acquisition, is, you're going to buy, you're going to buy a watch from me, so you give me the money. Okay. Have you taken possession of the watch? No. Have you acquired the watch? You paid me, but you haven't acquired the watch yet. Therefore, if now something happens to the watch before you acquire it, I, as the seller, even though I've already received the money, it's still my responsibility. And if the watch is ruined, I have to either replace it or give you your money back. But once you lift the watch, then even if you decide to leave it in my store or in my house until you can come and pick it up at a later date, now it's your responsibility, right? Because you have acquired the watch, that you made the formal act of acquisition. And lifting the object that's being purchased is a standard way of making a kinyan, an active acquisition. So what does that have to do here? So with regard to this last statement, why was Rabbi Shimon saying, after this list of the ways in which a slave could serve the new master and thereby the master acquires the slave, why does Rabbi Shimon say that no active acquisition should be greater than lifting? So with regard to this last statement, the Gemara says, what is Rabbi Shimon saying? In this case, as the first Tana, the one we just named who said that list, also said that a slave can be acquired by lifting. And the Gemara explains, this is what he is saying. The first Tana holds that if the slave lifted his master, the master acquires the slave because the slave is performing labor for the master. But if the master lifted the slave, the master does not acquire him, as the slave has not performed labor on behalf of the master. And it was with regard to this law that Rabbi Shimon said, acquisition generated through taking possession should not be greater than acquisition generated through lifting, as lifting acquires property in any situation. Consequently, one can acquire a slave even by lifting the slave off the ground. And that's where we'll stop. I'll take a few questions. But remember that tomorrow is Erev Tisha B'Av. Tomorrow night begins the saddest day on the Jewish calendar, and we don't learn Torah on Tisha B'Av. Some say after noon on Tisha B'Av you can, others say no. And that rule actually kicks in even before Tisha B'Av starts on the afternoon of Erev Tisha B'Av. So for that reason, we're going to have our class at noon Pacific tomorrow. And then we'll have no class on Tuesday, and we will resume at the regular time on Wednesday. Okay. Let's see if we have any questions on Bava Basra 53. I see Lucy has a question. Were there restrictions to whom a convert could leave his property? Could a convert explicitly leave his property to his non-Jewish brother, or was that not allowed? I believe he could definitely do that. I'm not totally sure, but I think a person can leave property in his will to whoever he wants. But in the absence of a will, then the property passes to his heirs, right? Meaning his children. If this convert had children after he became a convert, well, then they're his heirs, and they would inherit from him. But if he had no children, then who are his heirs? Well, then it could be his brother or his father or his mother, his family. But since he converted, so as a legal matter, when you convert to Judaism, you're considered that you have joined the family of Israel and left the family before. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have the warmest, beautiful, loving relationship with your family. But it does mean that under Jewish law, any property that you leave, they would not inherit unless you specified that they should. So in the absence of such a will, this is a person who left his property ownerless, and therefore somebody can come along and claim it like any other ownerless property. That's my understanding of that law. That's what we've got for today. So with God's help, again, tomorrow, special time, noon Pacific on Monday, because it's Erev Tisha B'Av.